I still have the key to his apartment from the year I was the only person he trusted with one. The same year he calls now when people ask about me, shaking his head with practiced concern, explaining how I became obsessed and couldn't accept boundaries. There's something seductive about being chosen as someone's lifeline, about being the person they call when the world has turned its back, the one they trust when trust seems impossible, the steady presence that stands between them and complete isolation. It feeds something deep and often unexamined, the need to be essential, irreplaceable, the kind of necessary that transcends ordinary friendship or romantic love. Before we get into the part that still hurts to tell, let us know where you're watching from and hit subscribe so you don't miss more deep, raw stories like this. I met Marcus during what he would later describe as the worst year of his life, though at the time he was still crafting more palatable versions of the story. It was November, and I was working late at the marketing firm where I'd been a mid-level account manager for 3 mostly satisfying years. The office was nearly empty, just the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of the cleaning crew working their way up from the lower floors. He appeared in our doorway around 9 p.m., not as a client or colleague, but as someone's plus one to what was supposed to be a small team gathering that had stretched into impromptu drinks. Jenna from Creative had invited him, a friend of a friend, recently moved to the city, looking to meet people in similar industries. The kind of networking introduction that happens a dozen times a week in any major metropolitan area. What struck me first wasn't his appearance, though he was objectively attractive in that carefully maintained way of men who understand their looks as professional assets. It was his isolation within the small group, not shyness exactly, but a quality of disconnection that seemed deeper than ordinary social anxiety. He participated in conversations without quite inhabiting them, laughed at appropriate moments without the humor reaching his eyes, maintained the surface performance of social engagement while remaining fundamentally unreachable. During a lull in conversation, while others clustered around the makeshift bar someone had assembled from office supplies and contraband alcohol, I found myself standing near him by the window overlooking the city lights. The silence between us felt comfortable rather than awkward, two introverts finding refuge from the social energy surrounding us. His response to my casual inquiry about his day surprised me with its honesty. Not the casual complaint about work stress or generic exhaustion that typically fills such exchanges, but a measured admission that every day felt long lately, that he was still adjusting to the city, to starting over, to the particular loneliness of being surrounded by millions of people while knowing virtually none of them. This admission cracked something open between us, not romantic chemistry, though that would develop later, but the recognition of shared understanding about isolation and reinvention. I had moved to the city 5 years earlier from a small Midwest town, had navigated the peculiar disorientation of building adult identity in a place where no one knows your history or holds you accountable to previous versions of yourself. We ended up talking past the official end of the gathering, past the departure of other colleagues, through the building's transition from active workplace to after-hours emptiness. The conversation meandered through safe topics, career frustrations, city observations, shared appreciation for obscure films, before gradually approaching more personal territory. He had moved here 6 months earlier, he explained, after what he described vaguely as major life changes that necessitated geographic and professional reinvention. The details emerged slowly, each revelation offered carefully as if being weighed for appropriate disclosure level. A divorce that had cost him most of his social circle. A business partnership that had ended badly, leaving him professionally isolated and financially strained. The death of his father, complicated by family dynamics that had made even grief a solitary experience. I found myself responding with unusual openness, sharing my own navigation of adult relationships and professional identity in a way I rarely did with colleagues or even close friends. Something about his careful vulnerability seemed to invite reciprocal honesty without the performance or judgment that typically constrained such exchanges. When we finally left the building together, exchanging contact information felt natural rather than calculated. Not romantic pursuit, but genuine interest in continuing a conversation that had revealed unexpected depth and compatibility. The kind of connection that develops occasionally between people who recognize something familiar in each other's approach to solitude and self-construction. Our friendship developed gradually over the following months. Coffee meetings that stretched into lunch, lunch that extended into early dinner, dinners that occasionally evolved into walking tour of neighborhoods neither of us knew well. The progression felt organic rather than forced, driven by genuine curiosity about each other's perspectives rather than romantic agenda or social obligation. Marcus proved to be intelligent company, well-read, politically aware, capable of discussing complex topics without the defensiveness or competitiveness that often characterizes professional networking relationships. He listened thoughtfully, asked perceptive questions, remembered details from previous conversations in ways that suggested genuine attention rather than performed interest. More significantly, he seemed to appreciate qualities in me that others often overlooked or took for granted. My tendency toward careful observation rather than constant commentary, my preference for deep conversation over social small talk, my capacity for patient listening without feeling compelled to offer immediate solutions or unsolicited advice. Characteristics that had sometimes been perceived as aloofness or disengagement in other contexts felt valued and understood in his presence. 6 months into our friendship, the first crisis arrived. Marcus lost his job due to company restructuring that eliminated his entire department. The termination came without warning, accompanied by minimal severance during a period when he was already financially stretched from divorce settlements and relocation expenses. His response to this setback revealed both vulnerability and resilience that deepened my respect for his character. No dramatic victim narratives or bitter recriminations against former employers, just honest acknowledgement of the practical challenges this created and realistic assessment of his options for moving forward. The kind of mature crisis management that suggested emotional intelligence and personal strength despite difficult circumstances. When he mentioned concern about making rent for the following month, my offer to help felt natural rather than calculated. Not dramatic rescue gesture, but practical support between friends facing temporary difficulty. The amount was manageable within my budget, the duration presumably brief given his qualifications and active job search efforts. His acceptance of this assistance came with appropriate gratitude and immediate discussion of repayment timeline. Nothing excessive or manipulative, just honest appreciation combined with clear intention to restore financial independence as quickly as possible. The interaction felt balanced and healthy, one person offering help they could afford, another accepting assistance they genuinely needed without sacrificing dignity or creating inappropriate obligation. This loan was repaid within 6 weeks, exactly as promised, accompanied by a thoughtful dinner at a restaurant beyond his current budget, but chosen specifically to acknowledge the significance of my support during a difficult period. The gesture felt proportionate and genuine, evidence of someone who understood both the material and emotional aspects of accepting help from friends. The second crisis followed 3 months later, a family emergency requiring immediate travel to his hometown for his mother's hospitalization following a serious car accident. The medical situation was legitimately urgent, but travel costs strained resources already stretched by recent unemployment and ongoing job search expenses. Again, my offer to help felt natural rather than calculated. This time not just financial assistance but practical support, covering his responsibilities at a freelance project we were both working on, managing his apartment maintenance during his absence, providing daily check-ins while he navigated complex family dynamics in a setting where he had limited support. The gratitude he expressed upon his return seemed genuine and appropriate. Not excessive emotional debt, but honest acknowledgement of how my support had enabled him to focus on family crisis without compounding stress about professional obligations or practical concerns. Evidence of someone who recognized and valued reliable friendship during genuinely difficult circumstances. These early experiences established a pattern that felt healthy and reciprocal despite the obvious financial imbalance. I provided material support when needed. He offered emotional engagement, intellectual stimulation, and genuine appreciation that felt proportionate to the assistance provided. The friendship seemed to benefit both participants without creating inappropriate dependency or uncomfortable obligation. The relationship evolved into romantic territory gradually over the course of our second year of friendship. Not dramatic transformation, but natural progression from deep platonic connection to something more intimate and committed. The transition felt organic rather than pressured, built on established trust and demonstrated compatibility rather than physical attraction or social convenience. Marcus proved to be a thoughtful partner in those early romantic months. Attentive without being possessive, communicative about needs and boundaries, respectful of my independence and existing relationships. The financial disparity between us remained significant. His career recovery was slower than anticipated, complicated by industry changes and increasing competition, but he contributed what he could and expressed appropriate appreciation for my continued support of our shared expenses. More importantly, he seemed committed to rebuilding his professional and financial stability rather than becoming comfortable with dependence on my resources. Applications submitted regularly, networking events attended despite the social anxiety they triggered, freelance projects pursued even when they paid less than his previous salary level. Evidence of someone working toward genuine partnership rather than settling into comfortable extraction. 18 months into our romantic relationship, Marcus landed a position that represented significant professional advancement: senior marketing director at a growing tech company, salary substantially higher than his previous employment, benefits package that included stock options and performance bonuses. The success felt validating for both of us, evidence that my support during his difficult period had contributed to outcomes that justified the investment of time, energy, and resources. His celebration of this achievement included appropriate acknowledgement of my role in enabling his recovery and professional positioning, expressions of gratitude for standing by him during uncertain circumstances, recognition that my stability had provided foundation for his reconstruction efforts, promises that this success would allow him to reciprocate the support I had provided and rebalance our financial dynamic toward true partnership. The first indication that something fundamental had shifted came not through dramatic confrontation, but through subtle changes in social dynamics. Friends who knew our history began making comments about how Marcus was doing so well and really turning his life around. Observations that felt initially positive, but gradually revealed an undercurrent of narrative revision that troubled me in ways I couldn't immediately identify. These comments implied a version of events where Marcus's success resulted primarily from personal resilience and professional competence rather than significant support from external sources, where his recovery was individual achievement rather than collaborative effort involving substantial contributions from committed partner, where my role was supportive presence rather than material foundation that enabled the very stability he was now being celebrated for achieving. When I mentioned these observations to Marcus, his response was dismissive rather than concerned. People simplified complex situations, he explained. They focused on outcomes rather than processes. They attributed success to individual effort because it created more compelling narratives than acknowledging the role of luck, timing, and support systems. His explanations were reasonable, but felt insufficient given the specific pattern I was observing. This wasn't general human tendency toward oversimplification, but systematic editing of recent history that minimized my contributions while highlighting his personal qualities. Not innocent narrative compression, but deliberate revision that served his current professional image at the expense of accurate representation of our shared experience. The second indication came through his introduction of me to new colleagues and professional connections. Not as the partner who had supported him through difficult transition, but as current girlfriend whose relationship with him represented recent development rather than sustained connection during challenging circumstances. Someone he had met after achieving stability rather than someone who had helped create the very foundation of that stability. When I raised this concern, Marcus's response revealed the first glimpse of what would eventually become a much larger pattern. Not defensive anger, but confused disappointment that I would focus on such details when the important thing was our current happiness and shared future success. Why did it matter how he characterized our relationship timeline to colleagues? Why was I concerned about credit for support that had been offered freely without expectation of public recognition? These questions reframed my legitimate concerns as petty grievances, my reasonable expectations as inappropriate demands for acknowledgement. They suggested that healthy relationships shouldn't involve scorekeeping or require explicit recognition of contributions, that truly supportive partners wouldn't need external validation of their significance. 2 years after first meeting Marcus during his lowest point, I was already becoming unrecognizable to myself, not through dramatic transformation, but through incremental adjustment to interpretations of reality that served his interests while undermining my own sense of what had actually occurred between us. The woman who had offered steady support during genuine crisis was slowly being rewritten as someone whose perceptions couldn't be trusted, whose memory was unreliable, whose version of events reflected emotional instability rather than factual accuracy. The inciting discovery wasn't any single revelation, but the gradual recognition that the person I had chosen as family, when he had no one, was systematically rewriting our history to position me as an unstable presence he had generously tolerated rather than the foundation upon which his recovery had been built. The evidence accumulated like sediment, layer by layer, until what had once seemed like solid ground beneath our relationship revealed itself as an unstable foundation built on shifting narratives and selective memory. Not dramatic revelations, but small, persistent discrepancies that collectively painted a picture I was reluctant to accept, that the person I had supported unconditionally was systematically erasing my contributions while rewriting me as the problem in our story. The first piece of concrete evidence arrived through my friend Sarah, who had attended a networking event where Marcus was a featured speaker on career resilience and professional reinvention. His presentation, she reported with obvious confusion, detailed his journey from personal and professional rock bottom to current success without mentioning the 18 months of financial, emotional, and practical support that had made his recovery possible. According to Sarah's account, Marcus described his transformation as a solo endeavor powered by determination, strategic thinking, and carefully cultivated professional relationships. He spoke eloquently about the importance of maintaining focus during difficult periods, about leveraging setbacks as opportunities for growth, about the value of persistence when others might choose easier paths. Inspiring content that positioned him as someone who had pulled himself up through individual effort and sound judgment. What was absent from this narrative was any acknowledgement of external support. No mention of the rent payments that had prevented eviction during his unemployment. No reference to the emotional stability provided by a committed partner who absorbed the stress and uncertainty of his transition period. No recognition of the practical assistance that had enabled him to focus entirely on job searching rather than managing basic survival needs. When I asked Marcus about this selective editing of our shared history, his response revealed a pattern that would become devastatingly familiar. Not defensive anger, but patient explanation of why my perspective was flawed. Professional presentations required simplified narratives, he explained. Audiences connected with individual achievement stories rather than complex support systems. Mentioning personal relationships would have diluted the message and reduced its impact on aspiring professionals facing similar challenges. His logic was superficially reasonable but fundamentally dishonest. This wasn't strategic storytelling but historical revision that served his current image while erasing my significance. The transformation of a collaborative effort into individual triumph, accomplished through omission rather than outright lies, but equally effective in establishing a false narrative about his journey from crisis to success. More troubling was his apparent belief in this revised version of events. Not conscious deception, but genuine conviction that his recovery had been primarily self-directed, with external assistance playing only minor supporting roles. The kind of motivated reasoning that allows people to maintain positive self-images while conveniently forgetting inconvenient dependencies or embarrassing vulnerabilities. The second piece of evidence emerged through casual social interactions with our mutual acquaintances. Comments that initially seemed supportive, but gradually revealed underlying assumptions about our relationship dynamic that didn't align with my lived experience. References to how patient Marcus was with my emotional needs. Observations about his generous tolerance of my intense personality. Casual mentions of how well he handled my tendency toward overreaction during stressful periods. These characterizations shocked me with their inversion of our actual dynamic. I wasn't the emotionally needy partner requiring patience and management. I was the stable foundation that had enabled his recovery and continued success. I wasn't intense or prone to overreaction. I was measured, supportive, consistently available despite his frequent crises and demands for attention. I wasn't being generously tolerated. I was providing the very tolerance and support that had made his transformation possible. When I attempted to address these mischaracterizations with the friends who had expressed them, their responses revealed how thoroughly Marcus's narrative had been disseminated and accepted. Not malicious gossip, but genuine concern for his well-being based on information he had apparently shared about our relationship challenges. Stories about my unrealistic expectations and difficulty accepting boundaries. References to my fixation on our early history and inability to appreciate his current success. Each conversation felt like stepping into an alternate reality where I was cast as the problematic partner in a relationship I had actually sustained through my own stability and generosity, where my legitimate concerns about acknowledgement and reciprocity had been reframed as emotional instability, where my accurate memories of providing support had been transformed into evidence of unhealthy attachment to credit and recognition. The most damaging evidence came through professional channels. A colleague mentioned meeting Marcus at an industry conference where he had spoken about maintaining work-life balance during career transitions. According to her account, he had referenced the importance of setting boundaries with people who become overly invested in your success and struggle to respect your independence once you no longer need their help. This characterization hit like physical assault. I hadn't become overly invested in his success. I had invested appropriately in a partnership I believed was mutual and reciprocal. I hadn't struggled to respect his independence. I had supported his autonomy while expecting reasonable acknowledgement of my contributions. I hadn't failed to accept that he no longer needed help. I had expected the gratitude and reciprocity that healthy relationships require as circumstances change. But Marcus's version positioned my reasonable expectations as pathological behavior. My desire for acknowledgement became possessiveness. My memory of providing support became unhealthy attachment. My expectation of reciprocity became an inability to accept boundaries. A masterful reframing that transformed his ingratitude into my instability, his historical revision into my emotional dysfunction. When I confronted Marcus directly about these professional references to our relationship, his response revealed the sophisticated nature of his gaslighting. Not denial of the statements, but recontextualization of their meaning. He hadn't been talking about me specifically, he claimed, but speaking generally about patterns he had observed in professional and personal relationships. If I recognized myself in these descriptions, perhaps that indicated something worth examining about my own behavior and expectations. This response was particularly devastating because it contained enough plausible deniability to make me question my own interpretation while simultaneously confirming my worst fears about how he perceived our relationship. The suggestion that my recognition of myself in his negative characterizations proved their accuracy rather than revealing his betrayal. The implication that my emotional response to being publicly misrepresented was itself evidence of the instability he was describing. The evidence continued accumulating through smaller interactions and observations. The way Marcus introduced me to new people in his expanding professional network, not as the partner who had supported him during difficult transition, but as someone he was helping through some personal challenges. The casual references to my anxiety issues when explaining why certain social or professional events might not be appropriate for me to attend. The patient tone he adopted when others were present, as if managing a difficult but beloved burden. Each instance felt minor in isolation, but collectively painted a comprehensive picture of systematic reputation management at my expense. Not random misunderstandings, but deliberate narrative construction that positioned him as successful, generous, and patient while casting me as needy, unstable, and inappropriately attached. A careful inversion of our actual dynamic that served his current image while destroying mine. The confrontation that finally brought these patterns into explicit focus occurred 8 months after Marcus's career recovery had stabilized. We were attending a housewarming party for one of his new colleagues, a social event where I was meeting most of the guests for the first time. Throughout the evening, I noticed the careful way he managed my interactions with others, steering conversations away from topics where I might reference our history, interrupting when I began sharing stories that included his period of dependency, subtly redirecting attention when I attempted to contribute to discussions about professional challenges or career transitions. The behavior felt protective on the surface but controlling underneath, not considerate management of my social comfort but strategic prevention of information sharing that might contradict his preferred narrative, not helpful guidance but systematic silencing disguised as thoughtful partnership. The breaking point came when another guest mentioned her own recent job loss and the stress it was creating in her relationship. I began sharing our experience navigating similar challenges, describing the mutual support that had helped us weather difficult circumstances together. Before I could complete the thought, Marcus interrupted with a joke about my tendency to overshare personal details and smoothly redirected the conversation to safer topics. The humiliation was immediate and comprehensive. Not just the public dismissal of my perspective, but the casual characterization of my honest sharing as inappropriate oversharing. The reduction of our meaningful history to embarrassing personal details that needed management rather than legitimate experiences worth acknowledging. The positioning of himself as the reasonable partner managing my social mistakes rather than someone attempting to hide inconvenient truths about our relationship. Later that evening, when I attempted to address this incident, Marcus's response revealed the full sophistication of his gaslighting strategy. He expressed concern about my social anxiety and suggested that my interpretation of his behavior might be influenced by insecurity rather than accurate perception. He wondered if I might benefit from therapy to address what seemed to be increasing sensitivity to ordinary social interactions. He offered to help me find appropriate professional support for what appeared to be growing emotional instability. This response was particularly devastating because it transformed my legitimate anger about being publicly dismissed into evidence of the very emotional dysfunction he was describing. My normal response to disrespectful treatment became proof of abnormal mental state. My accurate perception of being silenced became distorted thinking requiring professional intervention. The most insidious aspect of this gaslighting was how it made me question not just specific interactions, but my fundamental ability to interpret reality accurately. If Marcus was right about my emotional instability, perhaps my memories of supporting him were distorted by unhealthy attachment. If my social perceptions were unreliable, perhaps my understanding of our relationship dynamic was equally flawed. If I needed professional help to manage ordinary interactions, perhaps my version of our history couldn't be trusted. This systematic undermining of my confidence in my own perceptions was accomplished through patient, concerned manipulation rather than aggressive attack. Marcus never explicitly called me crazy or directly denied historical facts. Instead, he consistently reframed my memories as selective, my interpretations as influenced by anxiety, my reactions as disproportionate to circumstances. Death by 1,000 therapeutic suggestions, each positioning him as the stable partner concerned about my increasing detachment from reality. The evidence was overwhelming but difficult to present coherently because it existed in tone, implication, and systematic pattern rather than dramatic incident or explicit statement. How do you prove that someone is rewriting history when they never explicitly deny historical facts? How do you demonstrate gaslighting when the manipulation occurs through suggestion rather than direct contradiction? How do you defend against accusations of instability when the very act of defending yourself is presented as evidence of the dysfunction being described? 6 months of accumulating evidence had revealed a comprehensive campaign to reposition our relationship history, with Marcus as the successful, patient partner managing my emotional instability rather than the person whose recovery had been enabled by my unwavering support. Not random misunderstandings, but systematic narrative construction designed to serve his current image while destroying my reputation and undermining my confidence in my own memories and perceptions. The confrontation with this evidence left me facing an impossible choice: accept his version of reality and seek treatment for emotional problems I didn't believe I had, or maintain confidence in my own perceptions while being increasingly characterized as someone whose perspective couldn't be trusted. Either option served his interests while undermining mine, trapping me in a dynamic where defending my own reality became evidence of the very instability he was describing. Standing in our shared apartment after that housewarming party, looking at someone I had loved and supported unconditionally, I finally understood what had happened. The person I had chosen as family when he had no one had systematically transformed me from his foundation into his problem, from his supporter into his burden, from his partner into his patient. And he had done it so skillfully that even I was beginning to question whether my version of our story could possibly be true. The slow dissolution of your own reality is a peculiar kind of torture, not the dramatic shattering of trust that comes with discovered infidelity or financial betrayal, but the gradual erosion of confidence in your own perceptions, memories, and fundamental understanding of what has transpired between you and another person. It's death by 1,000 therapeutic suggestions, each one chipping away at your certainty until you begin to wonder if the person you've always known yourself to be actually exists, or if you've been living in a delusion of competence and stability. The first manifestation of emotional fallout wasn't anger or hurt, emotions that would have made sense and felt manageable. It was confusion so profound it affected basic daily functioning. I would sit at my desk at work, staring at emails that required routine responses, unable to trust my interpretation of their content. If I couldn't accurately assess whether Marcus's public dismissal of my perspective constituted disrespect or appropriate social management, how could I rely on my judgment about anything else? Sleep became elusive not because of anxiety or racing thoughts, but because of the exhausting mental loop of reviewing interactions, searching for evidence that might support either interpretation of our relationship dynamic. Had I actually been the stable, supportive partner I remembered being, or was I an emotionally needy person whose memories had been distorted by unhealthy attachment? Was Marcus genuinely rewriting our history, or was I experiencing some form of psychological breakdown that prevented accurate perception of reality? The questions weren't rhetorical or dramatic, they represented genuine uncertainty about fundamental aspects of my identity and experience. When someone systematically suggests that your perceptions are unreliable, your memory selective, and your emotional responses disproportionate, the cumulative effect isn't just hurt feelings but existential confusion about the nature of your own consciousness and competence. My appetite disappeared not from sadness but from the physical manifestation of cognitive dissonance. The body's rejection of nourishment when the mind cannot process contradictory information about reality. I would prepare meals mechanically, then find myself unable to eat them, not from emotional distress, but from the strange sensation that even basic biological needs couldn't be trusted when everything else about my perception seemed to be under question. Friends noticed the changes before I could articulate them. My usual decisiveness replaced by endless second-guessing. My natural confidence in social situations transformed into hypervigilant monitoring of others' reactions to detect signs that they might be seeing. The emotional instability Marcus had suggested was becoming apparent. The exhausting performance of normalcy when you're no longer certain what normal means or whether you're capable of recognizing it. Sarah, who had initially reported Marcus's networking presentation, became increasingly concerned about what she described as my diminished presence in our friendship. Not dramatic personality change, but subtle withdrawal from the confident engagement that had previously characterized our interactions. The way I now prefaced opinions with disclaimers about potentially flawed perception. The manner in which I sought validation for interpretations of events that I once would have trusted automatically. When she gently suggested that Marcus's behavior toward me seemed problematic, I found myself defending him with arguments that felt foreign even as I voiced them. Perhaps I had been overly focused on receiving credit for past support. Perhaps my expectations for acknowledgement were unrealistic in the context of his professional advancement. Perhaps my emotional responses to ordinary social situations had indeed become disproportionate and concerning. The words felt wrong in my mouth, but the alternative, maintaining confidence in my own perceptions when someone I loved was suggesting they indicated mental instability, seemed even more frightening. If Marcus was right about my deteriorating judgment, then trusting my own interpretation of his behavior would only confirm the very dysfunction he was trying to help me recognize and address. This internal conflict created a bizarre form of emotional paralysis. Unable to trust my own feelings, but equally unable to fully accept Marcus's characterization of them as symptoms of psychological problems. Caught between competing versions of reality with no reliable method for determining which was accurate. The most sophisticated form of psychological torture, making someone complicit in their own gaslighting by convincing them that resistance to the manipulation proves its necessity. Work became my only refuge because professional interactions still felt manageable and predictable. Colleagues weren't suggesting that my perceptions were unreliable or my emotional responses inappropriate. Projects had clear parameters and measurable outcomes that existed independently of subjective interpretation. The relief of operating in an environment where competence was observable and expertise was acknowledged rather than pathologized. But even this sanctuary was gradually contaminated by the uncertainty that had invaded other areas of life. I began questioning decisions that would have felt automatic before the relationship with Marcus destabilized my confidence in my own judgment, seeking excessive input from supervisors about routine choices, apologizing preemptively for perspectives that might be flawed or inadequately considered. The professional persona I had developed over years of competent performance slowly eroding under the weight of systematic self-doubt. The most painful aspect of the emotional fallout was its impact on my relationship with my own memories. Experiences I had lived through firsthand began to feel unreliable, as if they belonged to someone else or had been distorted through subsequent interpretation. Had I really provided the level of support I remembered, or had normal relationship reciprocity been inflated in my mind to seem more significant than it actually was? Had Marcus truly been dependent on my assistance, or had I inserted myself into his recovery process in ways that felt helpful but were actually intrusive? These questions weren't abstract philosophical concerns but practical uncertainties that affected daily decision-making and emotional processing. If my memories of being supportive were potentially distorted, how could I trust my assessment of current interactions? If my interpretation of past events was unreliable, what basis did I have for understanding present circumstances or making future choices? The psychological term for this experience is gaslighting, but the clinical label doesn't capture the lived reality of having your fundamental relationship with your own consciousness systematically undermined. It's not just manipulation, but a form of psychological colonization, where someone else's version of reality gradually displaces your own, not through force but through the suggestion that your native perception is inherently flawed and unreliable. 6 months into this emotional fallout, I was no longer recognizable to myself. The confident woman who had offered steady support during Marcus's crisis had been replaced by someone who questioned every interpretation, sought validation for every opinion, and approached even routine social interactions with the hypervigilance of someone navigating a minefield. Not dramatic breakdown, but comprehensive erosion of the psychological foundation that had previously enabled effective functioning and authentic self-expression. The most insidious effect was how this self-doubt became self-perpetuating. The more I questioned my own perceptions, the more evidence I created for the very emotional instability Marcus was describing. The more I sought reassurance about my interpretations, the more I appeared to be someone whose judgment couldn't be trusted. The more I monitored my own responses for signs of inappropriate intensity, the more artificially controlled and strange my behavior became. This created exactly the outcome Marcus's narrative suggested was already occurring: a person whose emotional responses seemed increasingly disconnected from social norms, whose need for validation appeared excessive, whose relationship with reality seemed tenuous and concerning. The perfect closed loop where the suggestion of instability created the very symptoms it claimed to be identifying. The isolation that resulted wasn't just social but existential. How do you maintain friendships when you're no longer confident in your ability to interpret others' behavior accurately? How do you engage in professional relationships when you're questioning your own competence? How do you trust romantic connections when you're uncertain whether your emotional responses are proportionate or pathological? I found myself withdrawing not from hurt or anger, but from the exhausting effort of navigating interactions when your fundamental relationship with your own perception has been compromised. Every conversation became a complex interpretive challenge rather than natural exchange. Every emotional response required analysis to determine whether it was appropriate or evidence of the dysfunction that was supposedly becoming apparent to others. The most devastating realization was that Marcus's campaign to reposition our relationship history was succeeding not just with others but with me. I was beginning to accept his characterization of my behavior as problematic, my memories as selective, my emotional responses as concerning. Not because the evidence supported these interpretations, but because the alternative, maintaining confidence in my own perceptions while someone I loved suggested they indicated mental illness, felt too risky and isolating. Therapy, when I finally sought it, initially made things worse. The therapist's questions about my relationship patterns and emotional responses felt like confirmation that professional intervention was indeed necessary. Her exploration of my family history and previous romantic dynamics seemed to validate Marcus's suggestion that my current difficulties stemmed from deeper psychological issues requiring treatment rather than reasonable responses to manipulative behavior. It took months of careful therapeutic work to begin distinguishing between legitimate emotional growth and systematic gaslighting, to recognize that questioning manipulative behavior isn't evidence of emotional instability, that expecting acknowledgement for significant support isn't pathological attachment, that maintaining confidence in your own memories when someone else attempts to revise them isn't rigidity but psychological self-defense. The turning point in therapy came when Dr. Rodriguez asked a simple question that cut through months of self-doubt. If a friend described to you the same relationship dynamics you've experienced with Marcus, what would you think about their partner's behavior? The immediate clarity of my response, that such treatment would be unacceptable and concerning, revealed how thoroughly I had internalized standards for my own treatment that I would never accept for others. This recognition didn't immediately restore my confidence or resolve the emotional fallout, but it provided the first stable foundation for rebuilding trust in my own perceptions. The understanding that my expectations for acknowledgement and reciprocity weren't pathological but basic requirements for healthy relationship functioning. That my memories of providing support weren't distorted but accurate accounts of significant contributions that deserved recognition rather than pathologization. Recovery from systematic gaslighting proved more complex than healing from other forms of emotional abuse because the damage was to the very mechanisms of perception and interpretation rather than just to feelings or self-esteem. Not just rebuilding confidence, but reconstructing the fundamental relationship with your own consciousness that allows for authentic self-expression and accurate assessment of external reality. Emotional fallout lasted far longer than the relationship itself. Long after leaving Marcus, I continued to second-guess interpretations that would have felt automatic before experiencing systematic reality distortion. Continued to seek excessive validation for perspectives that were entirely reasonable, but had been labeled as symptoms of psychological dysfunction. Continued to monitor my own emotional responses for signs of the instability I had been told was becoming apparent to others. But gradually, painstakingly, the foundation was rebuilt, not return to previous innocence but development of more sophisticated discernment between legitimate feedback and manipulative gaslighting. Not restoration of automatic trust in others but enhanced ability to trust my own perceptions even when they conflicted with someone else's preferred narrative. Not elimination of self-doubt but appropriate calibration of when such doubt was warranted versus when it served someone else's interests at my expense. 18 months after the relationship ended, I could finally articulate what had happened without questioning whether my interpretation was distorted by emotional instability or psychological dysfunction. Marcus had systematically rewritten our history to serve his current image while undermining my confidence in my own memories and perceptions. This wasn't relationship conflict or communication problems, but deliberate psychological manipulation designed to maintain his preferred narrative regardless of its impact on my mental health or social reputation. The emotional fallout had been comprehensive but not permanent, not dramatic trauma but subtle erosion that required conscious reconstruction rather than natural healing. The understanding that some forms of abuse target not just emotions or self-esteem, but the very capacity for reality testing that allows someone to distinguish between legitimate feedback and manipulative control. I was his family when he had no one. Now he tells people I'm crazy. But the woman who writes these words knows with hard-earned certainty that the only madness was believing someone who systematically suggested that her sanity was questionable while her support was indispensable. The emotional fallout nearly convinced me he was right. Recovery meant remembering that my perceptions, memories, and emotional responses had never been the problem. The moment that shattered my remaining illusions arrived not as dramatic confrontation, but as accidental eavesdropping on a conversation I was never meant to hear. 3 years after first meeting Marcus during his lowest point, 2 years after becoming his primary support system, 6 months after his professional recovery had stabilized into genuine success, I was standing outside the bathroom at his colleague's engagement party when his voice drifted through the slightly open door of an adjacent study. He was speaking to someone I didn't recognize, another guest from his expanding professional network, someone being introduced to the intricacies of his carefully curated personal narrative. The conversation had clearly been ongoing for several minutes before I became aware of it, my attention initially caught by the familiar cadence of his voice rather than the content of his words. The context that became clear as I listened was a discussion about relationship challenges and professional balance. The other person was describing difficulties with a girlfriend who had become clingy during his recent career advancement. Marcus was offering advice based on his own experience with similar situations, positioning himself as someone who had navigated comparable challenges with wisdom and patience. His words, delivered with the same thoughtful tone I had once found so appealing, described a relationship I didn't recognize despite living it daily. According to his account, he had been dealing with a long-term partner who had become increasingly unstable as his professional circumstances improved. Someone who had developed unhealthy attachments to credit for his success and couldn't adjust to his decreased need for support as his independence returned. The clinical precision of his language was almost impressive in its calculated cruelty, not dramatic denunciation but careful pathologization, not angry accusation but concerned observation. The tone of someone discussing a difficult situation he was managing with appropriate professional guidance and admirable patience. He described my requests for acknowledgement as obsessive need for validation. My accurate memories of providing support became distorted perceptions of her role in his recovery. My reasonable expectations for reciprocity were reframed as difficulty accepting boundaries as their relationship dynamic normalized following his return to stability. Most devastatingly, he characterized my emotional responses to his historical revision as evidence of the very instability he was describing. My confusion about his changing narrative became proof of psychological dysfunction. My hurt about being erased from his success story was presented as inappropriate possessiveness. My attempts to discuss our relationship dynamics were cited as examples of her inability to engage in healthy communication about changing circumstances. The sophistication of his manipulation was breathtaking. Every legitimate concern I had raised had been cataloged and recontextualized as symptom of psychological problems requiring management rather than reasonable response to manipulative behavior. Every emotional reaction to his gaslighting had been preserved as evidence supporting his characterization of my mental state. Every attempt to defend my own reality had been transformed into confirmation of the very unreliability he was describing. But the detail that crystallized everything, the moment when intellectual understanding became visceral recognition, was his casual mention of how he was helping her find appropriate therapeutic support for what seemed to be developing personality disorder traits. The implication that he was generously tolerating my psychological dysfunction while ensuring I received professional intervention for problems he had supposedly identified before they became more severe. Standing in that hallway, listening to someone I had loved and supported unconditionally describe me as mentally ill to a stranger, the remaining fragments of self-doubt finally disintegrated. Not because I was angry, though fury would come later, but because the clinical detachment of his description revealed the calculating nature of what had been done to me. This wasn't someone genuinely concerned about a partner's mental health. This was someone who had systematically constructed a narrative that served his current image while destroying mine, then weaponized my natural emotional responses to that betrayal as evidence supporting his false characterization. Someone who had not only erased my contributions to his success, but pathologized my very existence in his life. The conversation continued for several more minutes, but I had heard enough. Actually, I had heard far more than enough. The man offering sage advice about managing unstable partners was the same person who had spent 18 months accepting every form of support I could provide, financial, emotional, practical, social, without which his recovery would have been impossible. The person describing my unhealthy attachments was someone who had created those very dependencies through systematic exploitation of my generosity and loyalty. I didn't confront him immediately, didn't burst into the room with righteous accusations or dramatic revelations of eavesdropping. Instead, I returned to the party, engaged in surface conversations with other guests, and maintained the performance of normalcy while something fundamental shifted in my understanding of what I was dealing with and what needed to happen next. The turning point wasn't emotional epiphany but strategic recognition. This wasn't relationship conflict that could be resolved through better communication or therapeutic intervention. This wasn't misunderstanding that could be clarified through honest conversation or mutual effort. This was systematic psychological abuse designed to serve his interests while destroying my reputation and mental health. The man I had supported during his darkest period had become someone who could casually describe me as mentally ill to strangers while positioning himself as my patient, generous caretaker. Someone who could discuss my supposed psychological dysfunction with the clinical detachment of a case study rather than the emotional complexity of someone describing a person they supposedly loved. The drive home that evening passed in crystalline clarity rather than confused emotional processing. Not hurt or anger, those would come later, but perfect understanding of what needed to happen and why. The relationship couldn't be repaired because it had never been what I believed it to be. Marcus hadn't gradually become manipulative. He had revealed manipulation that had always been present but carefully concealed until his circumstances no longer required my support. Over the following days, I began methodically documenting the systematic campaign I could now recognize clearly. Not for legal purposes or public vindication, but for my own psychological protection against future gaslighting attempts. The pattern of historical revision, the strategic pathologization of normal emotional responses, the careful construction of narratives that positioned him as successful and patient while casting me as unstable and burdensome. The evidence was overwhelming once viewed through the lens of deliberate manipulation rather than relationship challenges or communication problems. Every conversation that had left me questioning my own perceptions. Every social interaction where he had subtly managed my contributions to prevent information sharing that might contradict his preferred narrative. Every therapeutic suggestion that had undermined my confidence while positioning him as concerned partner rather than manipulative perpetrator. Most importantly, I began recognizing the sophisticated nature of his gaslighting techniques. The way he never explicitly denied historical facts but consistently reframed their significance. The manner in which he transformed my reasonable expectations into evidence of psychological dysfunction. The skill with which he had made me complicit in my own reality distortion by convincing me that resistance to his narrative proved its accuracy. The confrontation, when it finally occurred, wasn't dramatic or satisfying. No moment of recognition or acknowledgement of wrongdoing. No apology or explanation that made sense of the systematic betrayal. Just calm presentation of my decision to end the relationship accompanied by clear boundaries about future contact. Marcus's response revealed the full extent of his manipulation skills. Not angry denial or defensive justification, but concerned suggestion that my decision was influenced by the very psychological instability he had been trying to help me address. The implication that ending our relationship proved the severity of mental health issues requiring immediate professional intervention. The offer to help me find appropriate therapeutic support during what was clearly a crisis period requiring specialized care. Even knowing what I now knew about his manipulation tactics, the sophistication of this response was almost impressive in its calculated cruelty. The transformation of my healthy decision to leave an abusive situation into evidence of the very mental illness he had been describing to others. The positioning of himself as concerned former partner rather than someone whose behavior had necessitated the separation. The continued pathologization of my perceptions, even as I was actively extricating myself from his influence. But the power of his gaslighting had been broken by the accidental revelation of his true perception of me. Hearing him describe me as mentally ill to a stranger while positioning himself as my patient caretaker had provided the external validation I needed to trust my own understanding of what had been happening. Not because his words were necessarily reliable, but because they revealed the calculating nature of someone who could discuss my supposed psychological dysfunction with clinical detachment while maintaining the performance of loving concern to my face. The weeks following our separation were characterized not by emotional devastation, but by cognitive restoration. The gradual return of confidence in my own perceptions, the relief of no longer having every emotional response analyzed for signs of instability, the simple freedom of interpreting interactions without constant monitoring for manipulation or gaslighting. Most significantly, I began reconnecting with aspects of myself that had been systematically undermined during the relationship. Professional competence that had never actually diminished despite his suggestions about my deteriorating judgment. Social skills that remained intact despite his management of my interactions with others. Emotional stability that had been genuine throughout, distorted only by his deliberate campaign to convince me otherwise. The turning point had provided something invaluable, external validation that my perceptions had been accurate throughout. Not because Marcus was inherently evil or because I was inherently virtuous, but because the systematic nature of his reality distortion was incompatible with genuine concern for my well-being. Someone who truly believed I was developing psychological problems wouldn't describe my situation with such clinical detachment to strangers. Someone genuinely worried about my mental health wouldn't use my emotional responses to his manipulation as evidence supporting his characterization. 3 months after overhearing that conversation, I was functionally recovered from the most sophisticated gaslighting campaign I hoped to ever experience. Not because I was stronger or smarter than others who might be vulnerable to such manipulation, but because accidental access to his unguarded assessment had broken the spell of self-doubt he had so carefully cultivated. The man who had described me as developing personality disorder traits to a stranger was the same person I had supported unconditionally during his recovery from personal and professional crisis. The person positioning himself as my patient caretaker was someone whose success had been built on a foundation of my unwavering loyalty and practical assistance. The concerned partner helping me find therapeutic support was actually the source of the very confusion and self-doubt that might have led others to seek such intervention. Understanding this didn't eliminate the damage that had been done to my reputation or the relationships that had been contaminated by his narrative, but it provided the clarity needed to begin rebuilding from a foundation of accurate rather than distorted self-knowledge. The recognition that I had been his family when he had no one, and his response had been to systematically convince others, and nearly convince me, that I was crazy. The turning point wasn't dramatic revelation but quiet certainty. I would never again allow someone to pathologize my reality while benefiting from my support. Never again mistake systematic manipulation for relationship challenges requiring therapeutic intervention. Never again doubt my own perceptions when someone's behavior toward me was incompatible with their professed concern for my well-being. Standing in my own apartment, no longer shared with someone who could describe me as mentally ill to strangers while accepting my daily emotional and practical support, the turning point felt less like victory than like awakening. Not triumph over adversity, but recognition of reality that had always existed beneath the carefully constructed illusion. I had been his family when he had no one. He had repaid that loyalty by attempting to convince everyone, including me, that I was crazy. The turning point was simply the moment I stopped believing him and started trusting myself again. The aftermath of systematic gaslighting doesn't resolve itself through separation or even recognition of what occurred. Unlike other forms of relationship trauma that leave visible wounds, the damage from having your reality systematically questioned and rewritten operates at a more fundamental level, affecting not just your feelings about one person but your basic trust in your own capacity to interpret the world accurately. 2 years after leaving Marcus, I was still discovering the extent to which his manipulation had infiltrated my psychological infrastructure. Not dramatic symptoms or obvious dysfunction, but subtle alterations in how I processed interactions, evaluated relationships, and trusted my own judgment. The kind of damage that reveals itself gradually through accumulated hesitation rather than immediate crisis. Professional settings became laboratories for testing whether my perceptions could be trusted. Meetings where I would monitor colleagues' reactions to my contributions, searching for signs that others might be seeing the emotional instability Marcus had described so convincingly to his network. presentations where I found myself qualifying observations with disclaimers about potentially flawed analysis, despite my expertise being well established and consistently validated by outcomes. The hypervigilance was exhausting but felt necessary. If Marcus had been able to convince people that my reasonable expectations for acknowledgement were actually symptoms of psychological dysfunction, what else might I be misinterpreting? If my memories of providing support could be reframed as unhealthy attachment, how could I trust my assessment of any interpersonal dynamics? This self-doubt had professional consequences that extended far beyond initial discomfort. Projects where I deferred to colleagues' judgment despite having more relevant experience. Leadership opportunities I declined because I questioned my ability to assess team dynamics accurately. Networking events I avoided because social interactions felt like potential minefields, where any emotional response might be pathologized by observers who had been exposed to narratives about my supposed instability. My reputation at work remained intact. Marcus's influence didn't extend into my professional sphere, and his characterizations of my mental state hadn't contaminated relationships with supervisors or colleagues. But the internal erosion of confidence created barriers to advancement that were entirely self-imposed. Not because others questioned my competence, but because I had internalized doubts about my own reliability that affected decision-making and risk assessment. The most persistent long-term consequence manifested in romantic relationships. Not inability to connect with others, but exhausting hyperanalysis of every interaction for signs of manipulation or reality distortion. The assumption that conflicting perspectives might indicate gaslighting rather than normal disagreement. The tendency to seek excessive validation for interpretations that were perfectly reasonable, but had been systematically undermined during the relationship with Marcus. Dating became an exercise in constant reality testing, rather than natural exploration of compatibility. First dates where I monitored potential partners' responses to my opinions, watching for subtle signs of dismissal or condescension that might indicate manipulative tendencies. Early relationships where I documented conversations and interactions, not from paranoia but from genuine uncertainty about whether my memories and interpretations could be trusted. The men I dated were generally kind and authentic, making my hypervigilance seem both unnecessary and off-putting. Normal relationship conflicts felt potentially sinister. Routine accommodations triggered anxiety about boundary erosion. Casual disagreements sparked internal questioning about whether my perspective was distorted by psychological issues that were becoming apparent to others. James, an environmental engineer I dated for 6 months, finally addressed the pattern directly after I sought validation for the 15th time about whether my interpretation of a minor scheduling conflict was accurate or evidence of unreasonable expectations. His feedback was gentle but illuminating. You ask for confirmation about things you clearly understand perfectly well. It's like you don't trust your own judgment about basic social interactions. His observation was accurate and concerning. I had developed a pathological need for external validation of perceptions that were entirely normal and appropriate. The systematic reality distortion I had experienced with Marcus had created lasting uncertainty about my fundamental capacity for accurate interpretation of interpersonal dynamics. Therapy helped identify these patterns but couldn't immediately reverse them. Dr. Rodriguez explained that recovery from gaslighting involves rebuilding trust in your own perceptions gradually, through accumulation of experiences where your interpretation is validated rather than questioned. Not dramatic healing, but slow reconstruction of psychological infrastructure that had been systematically undermined. The social consequences proved more complex and persistent than professional or romantic challenges. Marcus's narrative about my supposed emotional instability had been disseminated through our mutual social network with surgical precision. Not dramatic accusations that could be easily refuted, but subtle suggestions that accumulated over time into accepted understanding of my psychological state. Friends who had known me for years began treating me with careful consideration typically reserved for people with known mental health challenges. Conversations where my perspectives were acknowledged politely but not engaged seriously. Social invitations that came with implicit expectations about managing my emotional needs. The gradual transformation from equal participant to charitable project requiring sensitive handling. The most painful aspect of this social repositioning was its subtlety. No one explicitly told me they believed Marcus's characterization of my mental state. No dramatic confrontations or obvious rejection, just gradual shifts in how I was perceived and treated that reflected underlying assumptions about my psychological reliability. Sarah, my oldest friend in the city, eventually addressed the situation directly after months of increasingly strained interactions. Her approach was careful but honest. Several mutual acquaintances had expressed concern about my emotional stability based on information shared by Marcus. While she didn't personally believe these characterizations, the consistent nature of his narrative had created group consensus that I was dealing with psychological issues requiring accommodation rather than straightforward friendship. This revelation was simultaneously validating and devastating. Validating because it confirmed that my perception of changed social dynamics was accurate rather than paranoid interpretation. Devastating because it revealed the comprehensive nature of Marcus's campaign to reposition our relationship history while destroying my social reputation. The challenge of defending yourself against systematic character assassination is that any response risks confirming the very accusations being made. Explaining the actual dynamics of your relationship with the accuser can sound like elaborate justification from someone whose perception is supposedly unreliable. Expressing anger about false characterizations can appear to validate concerns about emotional instability. Providing evidence of manipulative behavior can seem like obsessive focus on past grievances by someone unable to accept responsibility for relationship problems. I chose strategic silence rather than public defense, focusing on rebuilding trust through consistent behavior rather than explicit refutation of Marcus's narrative. The approach was psychologically sound but socially costly. Without alternative explanations for the concerns he had raised, his characterizations stood unchallenged while I worked slowly to demonstrate reliability through actions rather than arguments. Some friendships survived this process, people who knew me well enough to recognize the disconnect between Marcus's descriptions and my actual behavior. Relationships strong enough to withstand temporary uncertainty while evidence accumulated about my genuine psychological state. Sarah remained supportive throughout, becoming an anchor of consistency, while other social connections were contaminated by doubt about my mental health. Other relationships were permanently damaged. Friends who had always found me somewhat intense or emotionally direct discovered that Marcus's narrative provided convenient explanation for discomfort they had felt but never articulated. Acquaintances who had minimal investment in our friendship found it easier to accept his characterizations than navigate the complexity of determining whose version of events was accurate. The professional network I had built over years of competent work remained largely intact because Marcus's influence didn't extend effectively into that sphere. His attempts to position himself as someone managing a partner's psychological difficulties didn't resonate with colleagues who had direct experience of my capabilities and emotional stability. Professional relationships proved more resistant to manipulation because they were based on observable performance rather than personal narratives. But the social fallout from his campaign extended beyond immediate friend groups to broader community connections. The rock climbing gym where we had been members together, the neighborhood coffee shop where he had carefully shared concerns about my increasing emotional volatility, the bookstore where staff had been exposed to his patient explanations of my obsessive tendencies regarding acknowledgement and credit. Each contaminated space required careful navigation or complete avoidance. The exhausting calculation of whether particular environments might contain people who had been exposed to his narrative about my supposed psychological dysfunction. The restriction of movement and activity based on potential encounters with those who had accepted his characterization of my mental state. The financial consequences were minimal but symbolically significant. Marcus never repaid the money I had lent during his crisis period, but his refusal was strategic rather than simply neglectful. Discussions about repayment were reframed as evidence of my obsessive focus on past contributions and inability to accept that circumstances had changed. My legitimate expectations for reciprocity became additional proof of the psychological dysfunction he was describing to others. The amount involved, several $1,000s accumulated over months of supporting his basic living expenses, wasn't devastating to my financial stability. But the reframing of those loans as evidence of unhealthy attachment rather than generous support served his narrative while ensuring that seeking repayment would reinforce his characterization of my emotional instability. 3 years after separation, the long-term consequences had stabilized into permanent adjustments rather than ongoing trauma. Professional confidence had been rebuilt through consistent validation of competence from colleagues and supervisors. Romantic relationships had gradually improved as I learned to distinguish between appropriate caution and pathological hypervigilance. Social connections had been rebuilt selectively, prioritizing depth over breadth while accepting that some relationships had been permanently contaminated. The most lasting consequence wasn't damage but development, enhanced ability to recognize manipulation tactics that had once been invisible. not paranoid suspicion of others' motives, but sophisticated understanding of how systematic reality distortion operates and how to protect against it. The expensive education in psychological warfare that made future manipulation attempts ineffective because their techniques were immediately recognizable. This hard-won expertise proved valuable beyond personal protection. Friends and colleagues began seeking my perspective when they encountered relationships that left them questioning their own perceptions. Professional situations where someone's competence was being systematically undermined through subtle character assassination. Family dynamics where one person's reality was being consistently invalidated while their emotional responses were pathologized. The ability to recognize gaslighting in others' experiences provided purpose that partially justified the cost of acquiring such knowledge. Not dramatic advocacy or public speaking, but quiet support for individuals navigating the disorienting experience of having their reality systematically questioned. The understanding that such manipulation succeeds through isolation and self-doubt, both of which can be countered through witness and validation. 5 years after first meeting Marcus during his crisis period, the long-term consequences had evolved from active damage to integrated wisdom. Not complete healing but functional adaptation. Not elimination of vulnerability but sophisticated protection against specific manipulation tactics that had once proven devastatingly effective. The woman who had offered unconditional support to someone with no family had become someone who understood exactly how such generosity could be exploited and weaponized. The person who had nearly accepted characterizations of her own mental instability had developed expertise in recognizing when reality distortion was being deployed strategically rather than emerging from legitimate concern. I had been his family when he had no one. His response had been to convince others that I was crazy. The long-term consequences included not just recovery from that betrayal, but immunity to similar manipulation in the future. Not because I had become suspicious or withdrawn, but because I had learned to distinguish between reasonable feedback and systematic gaslighting, between authentic concern and calculated character assassination, between relationship challenges requiring mutual effort and psychological warfare requiring strategic extraction. The expertise was expensive but invaluable, the kind of education that transforms survival into strength, vulnerability into vigilance, betrayal into protection for others facing similar exploitation. The long-term consequences weren't just personal but social, contributing to broader understanding of how systematic reality distortion operates and how it can be recognized and resisted before it destroys someone's confidence in their own perceptions and worth. 7 years have passed since I first encountered Marcus in that office break room, looking lost and disconnected at a networking event that was supposed to help him rebuild his professional life. 5 years since I finally left the relationship that had consumed my identity and nearly convinced me that my own perceptions couldn't be trusted. 3 years since I stopped monitoring social media for traces of his continuing narrative about my supposed emotional instability. The current state isn't dramatic transformation or complete vindication. Those narratives belong to movies where justice prevails and truth wins out over manipulation. Instead, it's something quieter but more substantive, the gradual reconstruction of a life built on authentic foundations rather than the shifting sands of someone else's psychological warfare. I live alone now by choice rather than circumstance. The apartment I found after leaving Marcus has evolved into something intentionally mine. Spaces arranged for comfort rather than managing someone else's emotional needs. Books chosen for personal interest rather than impressive spines for visitors who might report back on my mental state. Artwork selected because it moves me rather than because it projects appropriate stability for observers evaluating my psychological condition. This solitude isn't isolation or withdrawal but conscious decision to understand who I am when not defined by service to another person's image management. The space provides clarity impossible during years of reality distortion and systematic gaslighting. Quiet enough to hear my own thoughts without filtering them through someone else's characterizations of my mental health. Still enough to recognize authentic preferences that emerge without external pressure or pathologization. The work situation has stabilized and advanced beyond my most optimistic projections from those early months after separation. The design firm where I work promoted me to creative director 2 years ago, advancement that became possible once I stopped second-guessing every professional judgment and seeking excessive validation for routine decisions. The confidence that had been systematically undermined during the Marcus years has been rebuilt through consistent external validation of competence and reliability. My reputation among colleagues is solid, built on demonstrated performance rather than defended through explanations of past relationship dynamics. The woman who once questioned her own interpretation of basic social interactions is now the person others turn to for clear thinking and sound judgment. Not because I've become more talented, but because I'm finally present in my own professional life, rather than perpetually monitoring for signs of the emotional instability that was supposedly becoming apparent to others. Last month, I was offered a position as design director at a prestigious agency in Portland, opportunity that would have been inconceivable during the years when I questioned my basic competence and worried that colleagues might be seeing psychological dysfunction that I couldn't recognize myself. I accepted the position, not as escape from Marcus's continuing influence, but as natural progression of rebuilt confidence and restored professional trajectory. Family relationships remain complex but have significantly improved since I stopped apologizing for having reasonable expectations and clear memories of events that actually occurred. My parents, who had been concerned about my increasing self-doubt and social withdrawal during the Marcus years, have watched my recovery with relief and growing pride. Our conversations no longer include their gentle suggestions about therapy or their careful monitoring of my emotional state for signs of instability. My sister, who had witnessed some of Marcus's subtle reality distortion during family gatherings, recently observed that I seemed like myself again for the first time in years. Not dramatic personality change, but return to the confidence and social ease that had characterized me before learning to question every perception and seek validation for every interpretation. The sister who had watched me become increasingly hesitant and self-doubting has seen those qualities resolve into something stronger than previous innocence. The social consequences of Marcus's character assassination campaign have largely resolved through time and consistent demonstration of stability. Friends who had been exposed to his narrative about my supposed emotional dysfunction have gradually recognized the disconnect between his descriptions and my actual behavior. Not dramatic vindication, but slow accumulation of evidence that the psychological problems he described either never existed or were responses to his manipulation rather than inherent mental health issues. Sarah, who had been caught between loyalty to me and concern about reports of my instability, recently apologized for the period when she had treated me with the careful consideration typically reserved for people with known psychological challenges. Her acknowledgement wasn't necessary for our friendship, but was healing nonetheless, confirmation that my perception of changed social dynamics had been accurate rather than paranoid interpretation. The broader social network has been rebuilt selectively, prioritizing depth over breadth while accepting that some relationships were permanently contaminated by Marcus's systematic narrative management. New friendships formed through work and activities have no exposure to his characterizations, allowing authentic connection without the burden of defending against false accusations or proving psychological stability to people predisposed to question it. Dating resumed cautiously 3 years after leaving Marcus, not from loneliness or social pressure, but from genuine readiness to explore connection with another person without losing myself in the process. The relationships that have developed are characterized by mutual respect and reciprocal consideration, rather than one person's emotional needs dominating the dynamic while the other's perceptions are systematically questioned and pathologized. The man I've been seeing for the past year, David, an architect who specializes in sustainable design, knows the broad outlines of what happened with Marcus without requiring detailed explanation of every manipulation tactic or reality distortion technique. His response to my history has been appropriately supportive without being patronizing, concerned without being protective in ways that would reinforce doubt about my judgment or stability. Most importantly, David demonstrates through consistent behavior that healthy relationships don't require one person to question their fundamental perception of reality or accept characterizations of emotional dysfunction when expressing normal needs for acknowledgement and reciprocity. His approach to conflict resolution, boundary negotiation, and emotional expression provides daily evidence of how different authentic partnership feels from systematic psychological manipulation. Professional therapy concluded 18 months ago when Dr. Rodriguez determined that the gaslighting trauma had been successfully processed and integrated. Our final sessions focused on maintaining vigilance against future manipulation without developing generalized suspicion of others' motives. The balance between appropriate caution based on expensive experience and openness to genuine connection with people who demonstrate consistent respect for boundaries and reality. The most significant aspect of the current state is the complete absence of Marcus's direct influence on my daily life. No ongoing legal battles or financial entanglements, no shared social obligations or professional connections, no monitoring of his activities or concern about his continuing narrative about my supposed psychological dysfunction. Simple separation that allows focus on forward movement rather than defensive positioning against past exploitation. I discovered through mutual acquaintances that Marcus married someone 2 years ago, a woman who apparently knew nothing about our relationship history or the systematic campaign he had conducted to reposition me as emotionally unstable rather than foundationally supportive. The information came without emotional charge, just data about someone who no longer occupied psychological space in my daily experience. Whether his new relationship follows similar patterns of support extraction followed by reality distortion isn't my concern or responsibility. Whether he has developed genuine capacity for reciprocal partnership or simply found someone new to exploit isn't something I need to monitor or influence. The understanding that some people's behavior patterns are consistent regardless of relationship context, but my response to such patterns has evolved beyond vulnerability to their deployment. The current professional situation involves occasional encounters with Marcus's industry network through conferences and events, but these interactions have become manageable rather than anxiety-provoking. Colleagues who had been exposed to his narrative about my emotional instability have either forgotten those characterizations through time and contrary evidence, or they maintain their beliefs without it affecting professional interactions in observable ways. More importantly, I no longer monitor others' responses to my presence for signs that they might have been influenced by his character assassination campaign. The hypervigilance that once made every social interaction feel like potential validation or refutation of my psychological stability has resolved into normal awareness without pathological self-monitoring. The financial situation has recovered completely from the period when I provided support without reciprocity. The money Marcus never repaid, several $1,000s that had enabled his survival during crisis, no longer represents significant loss or ongoing grievance, just expensive education in the difference between temporary assistance and permanent extraction, between grateful recipients and entitled exploiters. The creative work that had been compromised during the Marcus years, when constant reality distortion made autonomous decision-making feel impossible, has returned with enhanced sophistication. The photography that was abandoned when every aesthetic choice felt potentially subject to pathologization has resumed with deeper technical skill and emotional range. The writing that had stopped when I questioned my own perceptions has evolved into clearer expression of complex experiences. Perhaps the most meaningful aspect of the current state is the ability to trust my own reactions to others' behavior without excessive analysis or validation seeking. The woman who once questioned whether her reasonable expectations for acknowledgement indicated psychological dysfunction now recognizes manipulation tactics immediately and responds appropriately without self-doubt or concern about appearing emotionally unstable. This discernment extends beyond romantic relationships to professional and social interactions where reality distortion might be deployed as control tactic. The colleague who attempts to reframe normal boundary enforcement as emotional overreaction. The friend who characterizes reasonable feedback as evidence of interpersonal difficulties. The family member who pathologizes authentic emotional responses to inappropriate behavior. Not paranoid suspicion of others' motives, but sophisticated recognition of when feedback reflects legitimate concern versus strategic manipulation. The expensive education in psychological warfare that transformed vulnerability into vigilance, exploitation into expertise, betrayal into protection for others facing similar reality distortion. 7 years after first meeting Marcus during his crisis, I can acknowledge what happened without emotional disruption or identity destabilization. He systematically extracted support while positioning himself for success, then repositioned our relationship history to serve his current image while destroying my reputation and nearly convincing me that my own perceptions were unreliable. Not unique evil but recognizable pattern of exploitation, followed by gaslighting to prevent accountability. Understanding this doesn't eliminate the time lost to recovery or the relationships damaged by his narrative management, but it provides context that allows integration rather than ongoing trauma, wisdom rather than continued victimization, strength rather than persistent vulnerability to similar manipulation in future relationships. The current state includes recognition that being someone's family when they have no one creates particular vulnerability to exploitation by those skilled at identifying and targeting natural generosity. That offering unconditional support during crisis doesn't guarantee gratitude or reciprocity once circumstances improve. That some people's response to receiving help is systematic erasure of their dependency, followed by character assassination of their supporters. But it also includes understanding that such exploitation succeeds only when its targets lack framework for recognizing reality distortion as deliberate strategy rather than relationship challenge requiring therapeutic intervention. That gaslighting effectiveness depends on isolation and self-doubt, both of which can be countered through witness and validation from others who recognize manipulation tactics. Standing in my new apartment in Portland, surrounded by life rebuilt on authentic foundations rather than someone else's image management requirements, the current state feels both ordinary and extraordinary. Not dramatic transformation, but quiet revolution, the simple miracle of inhabiting my own reality without apology or explanation. I was his family when he had no one. He told people I was crazy. The current state includes both of these truths without allowing either to define my identity or limit my future. Just expensive education that transformed survival into strength, vulnerability into wisdom, betrayal into expertise that benefits others facing similar exploitation. The woman who writes these words trusts her own perceptions, maintains appropriate boundaries, and recognizes manipulation immediately. Not despite what happened with Marcus, but because of it. The current state isn't recovery from trauma, but evolution beyond the patterns that made such trauma possible. Not returning to who I was before, but becoming someone who could never be victimized that way again. I keep Marcus's first voicemail saved in my phone's archived messages, though I haven't listened to it in over 2 years. The timestamp shows 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in November, 7 years ago. His voice sounds different in that recording, smaller somehow, genuinely vulnerable in a way that became impossible to distinguish from performance once I understood how skillfully he could weaponize his own pain. In that 3-minute message, he thanked me for the evening we'd spent talking after that office gathering, mentioned how long it had been since he'd felt understood by another person, expressed hope that we might continue the conversation over coffee sometime soon. No manipulation visible in hindsight, no red flags that might have warned of what was to come. Just authentic gratitude from someone who had forgotten what genuine connection felt like after losing everything that had once anchored his identity. That voicemail exists as evidence of a moment when our interaction was exactly what it appeared to be, two lonely people recognizing something familiar in each other's careful navigation of solitude and reinvention. Before crisis revealed character, before dependency became exploitation, before gratitude transformed into entitlement, support into erasure, loyalty into systematic betrayal. I preserve it not from nostalgia or lingering attachment, but as documentation of my own accuracy in initial assessment. The person who had moved me to offer friendship and eventual partnership wasn't fictional. Marcus had genuinely been lost, genuinely grateful, genuinely in need of exactly the stability and loyalty I provided. The connection I felt wasn't delusion, but recognition of authentic vulnerability that existed before circumstances revealed what he was capable of doing to those who helped him most. This distinction matters because it protects against the cynicism that can develop after experiencing sophisticated manipulation. The assumption that all expressions of need are strategic, all vulnerability is performance, all gratitude is temporary calculation. The defensive withdrawal that treats every request for support as potential exploitation, every emotional connection as possible foundation for future betrayal. 7 years later, I can distinguish between the Marcus who left that voicemail and the person who eventually described me as mentally ill to strangers while positioning himself as my patient caretaker. Not because he was two different people, but because crisis and recovery revealed priorities and character that had been obscured by circumstances. The gratitude was real when he needed help. The manipulation became real when he no longer wanted to acknowledge how much help he had received. The most painful recognition isn't that I was naive to trust someone experiencing genuine vulnerability. It's that my support was so comprehensive, so foundational to his recovery, that acknowledging it honestly would have required him to fundamentally alter his self-concept and public image. Easier to rewrite history than to live with accurate understanding of his dependence. Simpler to pathologize my memory than to honor the reality of what had occurred between us. This understanding doesn't excuse the systematic character assassination or the gaslighting campaign that nearly convinced me my own perceptions were unreliable, but it provides context that allows integration rather than ongoing bitterness. Marcus didn't destroy my reputation and attempt to undermine my sanity because he was inherently evil. He did it because acknowledging the full extent of my contributions to his success would have been incompatible with the narrative he needed to maintain about his own resilience and independence. The psychological sophistication of his manipulation wasn't necessarily conscious strategy, but could have been instinctive self-protection. The automatic deployment of reality distortion to maintain identity coherence when truth became inconvenient. The reflexive pathologization of anyone whose memories threatened his preferred version of events. the systematic erasure of dependency as psychological necessity rather than calculated cruelty. Understanding this pattern doesn't minimize its impact or excuse its deployment, but it explains how someone can express genuine gratitude for support while simultaneously working to ensure that support becomes invisible in retrospective accounting. How authentic vulnerability can coexist with manipulative exploitation. How real connection can transform into systematic betrayal without obvious transition point or dramatic character revelation. The lesson isn't to avoid helping others during crisis or to withhold support from those experiencing genuine need. It's to recognize that some people's response to receiving help is immediate integration of assistance into their identity narrative, while others require subsequent erasure of dependency to maintain self-concept coherence. The difference isn't always apparent during crisis, but becomes clear through behavior during recovery. People who can acknowledge support received tend to express gratitude that persists beyond immediate need. They reference assistance provided when discussing their recovery with others. They demonstrate awareness of how external help enabled their success rather than attributing achievements entirely to personal resilience. They maintain relationships with supporters based on appreciation rather than terminating connection once dependency ends. People who require erasure of dependency begin revising history before circumstances fully stabilize. They minimize the significance of help received while maximizing their own role in recovery. They become uncomfortable with supporters' presence in their expanding social networks because it creates potential for narrative contradiction. They gradually distance themselves from anyone whose memories of their vulnerability might complicate current self-presentation. Marcus fell decisively into the second category, but this became apparent only after his professional recovery had stabilized and his need for support had diminished. During crisis, his gratitude seemed genuine because it was genuine. During recovery, his manipulation became sophisticated because my continuing presence represented ongoing threat to the independence narrative he was constructing about his transformation. This pattern extends beyond individual relationship dynamics to broader social understanding of dependency, support, and recovery. Cultural narratives that celebrate individual resilience while minimizing collective assistance. Professional environments that reward self-made success stories while discouraging acknowledgement of help received. Social structures that make dependency shameful rather than recognizing interdependence as fundamental human condition. Marcus wasn't unique in his discomfort with accurate accounting of support received. He was extreme in his willingness to pathologize and destroy those who had helped him rather than simply expressing appropriate gratitude. But the underlying psychology, the need to maintain self-concept coherence by revising inconvenient history, operates across many contexts where people prefer heroic narratives about individual achievement to complex stories about collaborative effort and mutual assistance. The sophistication of his reality distortion techniques suggests this wasn't his first experience with dependency erasure. The clinical precision with which he pathologized my emotional responses indicates practiced skill at transforming legitimate concerns into evidence of psychological dysfunction. The systematic nature of his character assassination campaign reflects developed expertise at narrative management rather than spontaneous defensive reaction. I wasn't his first victim, and I probably wasn't his last. The woman he married 2 years after our separation likely experienced some version of the same pattern if she provided significant support during any subsequent challenges he faced. Not because Marcus was incapable of growth or change, but because his fundamental discomfort with dependency would persist until addressed through genuine therapeutic intervention rather than strategic relationship management. Whether he ever developed insight into these patterns isn't my concern or responsibility. Whether his current relationships are characterized by reciprocity rather than extraction isn't something I monitor or influence. The understanding that some people's psychological structures make acknowledgement of help received essentially impossible, regardless of how comprehensive or crucial that assistance might have been. My responsibility was learning to recognize these patterns early rather than investing years in someone whose character made gratitude and reciprocity unlikely once crisis passed. Developing discernment between temporary vulnerability that enhances empathy and fundamental discomfort with dependency that requires erasure of supporters. Understanding the difference between people who integrate help received into their identity narrative and those who require systematic revision of history to maintain self-concept coherence. This discernment now operates automatically rather than requiring conscious analysis. Not paranoid suspicion of others' motives, but sophisticated pattern recognition based on expensive experience. The ability to distinguish between appreciation that persists beyond immediate need and gratitude that evaporates once dependency ends. The understanding that some people's relationship to receiving help is fundamentally incompatible with sustained connection to their helpers. The most profound insight isn't about Marcus specifically, but about the nature of chosen family and unconditional support. Being someone's family when they have no one creates particular intimacy and vulnerability that can be exploited by those skilled at identifying and targeting natural generosity. The people most likely to step forward during others' crises are often those most susceptible to subsequent manipulation, because their willingness to help indicates psychological characteristics that can be weaponized. Recognizing this doesn't require withdrawal from helping others, but does demand more sophisticated evaluation of character during crisis, rather than assuming that gratitude expressed during need will persist once circumstances improve. The understanding that crisis reveals some aspects of character while obscuring others. That dependency can bring out either humility or resentment, depending on someone's fundamental relationship to receiving assistance. 8 years after first meeting Marcus in that break room, I can articulate what I couldn't understand then. Being chosen as someone's lifeline during crisis is simultaneously honor and warning. Honor because it represents recognition of stability and loyalty that others find lacking in their environment. Warning because some people's response to receiving comprehensive support is systematic attempt to ensure that support becomes invisible once it's no longer needed. The woman who offered unconditional loyalty to someone with no family has become someone who understands exactly how such generosity can be exploited and erased. The person who nearly accepted characterizations of her own emotional instability has developed expertise in recognizing when reality distortion is being deployed strategically rather than emerging from legitimate concern about someone's mental health. I was his family when he had no one. His response was to convince others that I was crazy. This truth no longer carries active pain, but serves as permanent education about the difference between temporary vulnerability that enhances character and fundamental discomfort with dependency that requires destruction of witnesses to weakness. The lesson isn't to avoid being family to those who need one. It's to recognize that some people's psychological structure makes them incapable of maintaining relationships with those who have seen them at their lowest points. Not because they're evil, but because their self-concept requires erasure of evidence that contradicts preferred narratives about their independence and resilience. Understanding this doesn't prevent all future exploitation, but creates framework for recognizing patterns before they consume years of life and nearly destroy confidence in your own perceptions. The expensive education that transforms survival into strength, vulnerability into vigilance, betrayal into protection for others facing similar dynamics with people whose gratitude has expiration dates and whose recovery requires amnesia about who made it possible. The voicemail remains archived not as testament to what was lost, but as evidence of what was real before it became inconvenient. Proof that authentic connection preceded systematic betrayal. Documentation that my assessment of someone's character during crisis was accurate, even though crisis couldn't reveal how that character would respond to recovery and success. In the end, perhaps that's the most important recognition. Being someone's family when they have no one is always a risk. Some people honor that choice with lifelong gratitude and reciprocal loyalty. Others repay it with systematic erasure and character assassination designed to eliminate witnesses to their vulnerability. The difference isn't always apparent during crisis, but becomes clear through behavior during recovery. Those who can integrate help received into their identity remain connected to their helpers. Those who require erasure of dependency to maintain self-concept coherence will destroy anyone whose memories threaten their preferred narratives. I was his family when he had no one. Now he tells people I'm crazy. Both statements are true. Only one of them reflects reality, but both reveal character, his capacity for systematic betrayal, mine for choosing loyalty despite recognizing its risks. The woman who writes these words still offers support to those experiencing genuine crisis. But she now understands that some people's response to being saved is ensuring their saviors become invisible, discredited, or destroyed. Not cynicism, but wisdom. Not withdrawal, but discernment. Not fear of connection, but understanding of when gratitude has limits and loyalty flows in only one direction. The archived voicemail remains as a reminder of what genuine vulnerability sounds like before it learns to weaponize itself. Evidence that connection was real before it became inconvenient. Proof that being someone's family when they have no one is sometimes the most dangerous gift you can offer, not because they don't need it, but because some people's recovery requires forgetting they ever did.